Poetry, from Homer to Duffy. Welcome to this Year 8 English Poetry unit. In this poetry unit, you're going to be learning about the great influence of classical literature on Western literature and Western poetry. When I talk about classical literature, I'm referring to the great body of work by ancient Greek and Roman authors. These have had a great impact on many authors for thousands of years, including Dante, Shakespeare, John Milton, Tennyson, James Joyce, Alexander Pope, Oscar Wilde, and many others. Famous characters and heroes such as Helen, Penelope, Achilles, Agamemnon, Ajax, Odysseus, monsters such as the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the Cyclops, witches and goddesses like Circe, Calypso, Zeus, Athena, Aphrodite, etc. are found in all sorts of Western literature. One poet stood out, however, and we will be focusing on him. This was the great Homer. Western literature begins with Homer. The two long, heroic epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, appear suddenly. We don't know much about any poetry that preceded before them, if indeed there was any, and composition, or writing, in prose had not yet begun. These great epics never lost their fascination for the ancient Greeks, and they continue to form the basis of Greek education. The Romans in turn fell under their spell, and Homer became the model of the great Roman writer Virgil, who was to be the master of Roman epic poetry when he wrote the Aeneid. And he in turn inspired great authors such as Dante and Milton, who in turn have inspired many others, and the cycle goes on. In this poetry unit, you will be reading excerpts from Homer's Odyssey and analysing the language and the stories and the characters, and you're also going to be comparing them with various examples of other poetry from Western literature, including some modern poetry. So who was this great poet, Homer? And when was he writing? Before we discuss this, I want you to think firstly about what is the oldest poem that you know. When was it written? My guess is that this poem goes so much further back than that. First of all, let's discuss the Homeric question. Who was Homer? And did he actually exist? Was he one man? Or was he many writers? Nothing is actually known for certain about who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, or about its date and place of composition, or place it was written, and there is much debate by scholars, and there has been for years and years and years. This is because there are no references inside the poem to the author, or to the origin of the poems. Greeks, the ancient Greeks, all agreed on the name Homer, and there was a persistent tradition he was blind, because one of the characters in his poems, Demodocus, was a blind poet. And there are different views concerning his date and birthplace. However, many scholars agree that the poem was first written down around 590 BC by Greek scribes. However, they think it was composed or created much earlier, probably around 200 years earlier, sometime in the 8th century BC. And they believe that it was composed in the area of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Western Turkey. Some scholars believe that Homer, if he existed, came from the island of Chios. At this time, Asia Minor was a part of ancient Greece. During the time that it was composed, Greece had just emerged from an age of illiteracy and political confusion, an age called the Dark Age. And at this point, people were still accustomed to hearing rather than reading their literature. This is called oral poetry. The Homeric poems are the oldest surviving texts in Greek culture. The Iliad and Odyssey were put down in writing in the archaic Greek period, which is the 900s or the 800s, 700s BC. The classical period in Greece, in the 500s BC, saw a great rise in popularity of these Homeric poems. And there were in fact competitions in which professional reciters of Homer's poetry, called rhapsodes, would compete for prizes and earn lots of money and gold in competitions such as the Great Panathenaea Festival in Athens, and even at places like the ancient Olympic Games. Also in the end of the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great had conquered much of the known world, and there had been a great spread of Greek culture. He'd set up libraries in Alexandria, which is in Egypt, and Pergamum, which is now Turkey. And in these libraries were many versions and copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which had been written down. An example is here on the right. So many different copies were written by ancient scribes, and there are several different versions that have emerged. Here on this map we can see the area of Asia Minor, which is down here, and some of the islands as well linked with that, Chios, and here's ancient Greece around here. Here is the great citadel of Troy, which we will be talking about a little bit later on. Just to put it into context, here are the ancient Greek eras. I was talking about the Dark Ages, so a time when there was no writing or any culture of that archaeologists have been able to find. And then all of a sudden, the Iliad and the Odyssey suddenly appear in ancient Greek in the Archaic Age. The Classical Age is when these great poems are being recited in competitions, and then the Hellenistic Age is just after Alexander the Great. So, did Homer exist then? The scholar Friedrich Wolff in the 18th century raised this question. He decided that he wasn't going to deny the existence of Homer. He believed Homer had existed and had probably started the poems in their early form. But he declared in 1795 that the Homeric poems, as we now know them, did not have a single author, but had progressively evolved, as successive rhapsodes or reciters of the poetry had added to and developed what had come down to them. So what is epic poetry? Epic poetry comes from the ancient Greek word epos, meaning word, story or tale. It's a lengthy narrative poem, usually must concern a serious subject which contains details of heroic deeds and events significant to a culture or nation. And it evolved in pre-literate societies, pre-literate meaning before writing existed. The first epic poems were products of these pre-literate societies, and therefore they had to rely on oral poetry. So it's highly likely that Homer first of all composed the poem in oral poetry form. Here is the bard. The bard was the singer of these great epic poems, because epic poems would have actually been sung, not said. The bard usually sang his heroic poems to the accompaniment of a lyre, a musical instrument rather like a small harp. It is not clear whether the bards accompanied themselves during recital or someone else played it for them. Due to the epic lengths of the poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey could not have been recited in one sitting. These bards would have to rely on their memory to recite these poems. The poems are usually divided into short episodes, each of an equal status, interest, and importance. The poet or the bard recalls each episode in turn and then uses the completed episode to recreate the entire epic as he performs it. There are many different characteristics of epic poetry, and you will notice many of these when you are reading the different passages from the Odyssey during this unit. The main characteristics are: it's a long narrative poem. The speaker is a narrator who tells a story. The theme or the subject of the tale is important. The setting is huge. It could be a sea, a region, the world, or a universe. There is a main character who is, or is capable of being, a hero, and who may embody the values of the civilization. The action includes extraordinary or superhuman deeds. Usually the epic hero has a goal and has embarked upon a long journey. In this journey he struggles with natural and supernatural obstacles and antagonists, such as gods, monsters, and other humans, and these test his bravery, wits, and his battle skills. The gods or supernatural beings take a part or even an interest in the action. And the purpose of an epic is not just to entertain, but also to teach and inspire the listener or reader, with examples of how people can strive and succeed against great odds. When a poet narrates an epic, you will notice that the tone is very formal rather than conversational, and the poet always makes use of amazing figurative language. It's a language or speech containing images which make the narrative vivid and exciting for listeners and readers. Homer, as a poet, was heavily inspired by ancient stories of heroism. Homer's audience was fascinated by tales of the Mycenaean era of 500 years earlier. Everything back then seemed bigger or greater. Homer's poetic tales describe famous people and events from history as well as from legends, myths, and folk tales, characters and events that people had been describing for centuries. In his poems, Homer added his insights into human experience. He adds imaginative plots and his expert storytelling style to these facts and fictions. In the next lesson, you will be using ICT to hunt out how Homer and modern writers have made use of other mythological tales. What does this name imply? Mythological. Make a list of the myths with which you are familiar in any culture. Make sure you find out the background myth to Homer's Odyssey. You can find a version of this on the VLE. I also want you to look into intertextuality, because this is a key feature of this course. Go and find a definition for this technical device. Lastly, if you're thirsty for more, and some of the topics that I've discussed have interested you, then there are various things that you can look into. On the VLE, you can listen to excerpts from the Iliad and the Odyssey being recited in ancient Greek. You can listen to the ancient Greek lyre being played. You can also listen to an audio recording of the Odyssey being read in English. If you would like to maybe read the whole of or parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey, I have copies that you can borrow. And I also have a wide range of other classical literature and mythology books that I'm willing to lend you. Please come and find me. You might be interested in doing some research on other epic poetry from other cultures, or perhaps finding out more about the ancient Greeks or Romans, and you can check out the school library and the classics library for more. Lastly, keep an eye out for details on the Golden Sponge Stick competition, which is a competition which is being run in December.